Hi, so in this presentation, I want to go over a case study of speech codes. Speech codes were very common across university campuses in the 1990s. And this particular case takes place on the University of Pennsylvania campus in 1993. The facts I'm getting from a book that was written by a guy who was a professor there at the time. He ended up adopting this particular case as sort of his cause, and then wrote a book about it later called The Shadow University. It's by Kors and Silverglade. So the University of Pennsylvania's campus, and it all started at a dormitory. I don't know if it was this particular dormitory or some other dormitory, but I thought this one looked kind of like a representative dormitory on the University of Pennsylvania campus. So it all started in this dormitory, and as people do in dormitories, students were studying, and they were studying pretty hard. I guess exams were coming up, and they were studying hard. And there they are in their dormitory, and then out in front of the dormitory, and on the courtyard of the campus, this sorority, and I don't know if it was Alpha, Sigma, Theta, or which sorority it was, but it was some sorority, and it happened to be predominantly African American. All right, so the members were mostly black, and they were hosting some sort of ceremony on the campus right in front of this dormitory, and they were stomping, they were chanting, dancing, singing, I don't know what all, but anyways, they were making a lot of noise. It was really loud, and as you can imagine, people in this dormitory who were studying were getting kind of annoyed, right? They were getting annoyed that these women were out there stomping and chanting in front of their dormitory when they were trying to study, and as you can imagine, a lot of people started shouting at them, telling them to be quiet, and by the accounts of the women, a lot of the people who were shouting at them were shouting racial slurs, okay? Now, we don't know, right, because this is coming from the women, but that's what they say, and there's no reason to doubt them, that probably some of the people in the dormitory were shouting things that were offensive. And so they then went to campus security and reported the incident, and the security then went through the dormitory and knocked on doors and said, hey, did you shout anything out the window, and if so, what? And everybody in the dormitory denied it. Said, no, not me. I mean, I heard people shouting things, but no, I didn't shout anything. Except for one person. He fessed up. Eden Jakubowicz. He fessed up and said, yeah, of course. They were being obnoxious. They were being really loud. I was trying to study, so yeah, I yelled something. And they said, well, what did you yell? And he said, I said, shut up, you water buffaloes. Now, that's probably not the first thing that would have come to your tongue. But apparently that was the first thing that came to his tongue. He said, shut up, you water buffaloes. And when they asked him why did he say that, he said, I don't know. It just, that was the first insulting thing that came to my mind. A bunch of people being loud and making a lot of noise and shouting and stuff. I just, you call them water buffaloes. And they said, well, that was clearly racist. They charged him with violating the speech code of the campus. And it seems that probably the administration just expected him to kind of roll over. They expected him to say, yeah, I'm really sorry. That was a terrible thing for me to say. I'll never do it again. And then they would give him some sanction and it'd be over. But Jakubowicz didn't. He said, look, no, look, maybe what I did was rude. To shout out a window, that was not a polite thing to do. And, I'm sorry that I made them mad that way. But, in my defense, they were being obnoxious. And, I felt like, it was within my rights to yell at them for being obnoxious when I'm trying to study. And he said, so I'll apologize for being rude, but I was not racist. That racism never came into my head. This was just something I shouted at them for being loud, had nothing to do with their color. The administration's policy was, they said, well, clearly it was racist because water buffaloes are primitive, dark animals that live in Africa. There's a little bit of geographic ignorance there. Water buffaloes don't live in Africa. But putting that aside, I'm not sure that it's so clear that that was racial. Now, the women said, yeah, we felt like we had been racially slurred. And I won't argue with that. I'm sure they did. I'm sure that they felt that it was targeting their race. That's their word. Eden Jacobowitz says, no, it had nothing to do with race. And we can't look at either one of those sides alone, right? So one side we're looking at the reaction to the Speech Act. In the other one we're looking at the intentions behind the Speech Act. And what I want to argue is that we can't look at either one of them in isolation. That you may be offended, but that doesn't mean that it was hate speech. On the other hand, you may not have intended it as hate speech, but that doesn't make it not hate speech. So we can't look at either one of those in isolation. As a linguist, what I would say is that we need to look at yet the third pillar, which is the conventions of the words themselves. So one of the things I would say is, well, we've got to look at this word and say, do speakers of the language think of this as being a racial slur? Are the conventions of the language such that this word is conventionally associated with, hateful feelings about a particular race, in this case, blacks? Now, the lawyer for Jacobowitz looked at it and actually put out the query. And everybody he queried said, no, I've never even heard of water buffalo being used as a slur, but I've certainly never heard of it as a slur for African Americans. And the lawyer then put it as a query on Linguistics. Linguistics is a listserv, an email list. And nearly every practicing linguist in the world belongs to this list. So in 1993, many people were on this list. They all received this query asking, have you ever heard of water buffalo being used as a racial slur against blacks or African Americans? And everybody who responded said, no, I've never heard of that. Until one guy, this scholar from Israel, Dan Ben Amos, wrote back and said, is this young man by any chance a Hebrew speaker? Yes, does he speak Hebrew? And the lawyer said, I don't know. I'll go ask him. So he went and talked to Jacobowitz and said, do you know any Hebrew? And Jacobowitz said, well, yeah, I went to yeshiva. And, they taught us Hebrew there. And then he said, well, I never occurred to me before. But yeah, all these years, the rabbis and teachers were calling me a behemoth. And, anytime that anybody would be oafish or being silly or stupid or anything like that or clumsy, the rabbis and the teachers would call them behemoth. And the students at the yeshiva also started calling each other behemoth. Well, behemoth literally translates to water buffalo. And so Jacobowitz said, well, of course, subconsciously, that was the first word that came to my mind. That's the one that I've been called all these years when I was being oafish, when I was being too loud or anything. They would call me a behemoth. And, so that, it was part of my subconscious. And when I was speaking English, it just kind of came out. That's why I called them water buffalo. So, what's going on there is that when we look at it from the, purely linguistic side, it's not racial. It's a slur, but it's not a racial slur, right? It's a broad slur. It can be applied to anybody. And the point of the speech codes was that the speech, to qualify as hate speech, had to target a particular class. And this doesn't. So now, at that point, the administration really kind of saw the writing on the wall. They started getting some really bad press, and they backed off, and Jacobowitz was cleared of all charges. Now, he was fairly traumatized by the whole incident, and as I remember, I think he transferred out of the University of Pennsylvania. But I think this case study is fairly representative of the problems with it, because the speech codes had to be broad enough that they wouldn't rule out just any use of a slur, right? Even a racial slur. Because as we've seen, nigger, for example, one of the most hateful of racial slurs, isn't always used with negative intents and isn't always offensive to the recipients. What I mean is that, for example, between two African Americans, they may call each other nigger or nigga, and that's going to be okay in that context. And so the university doesn't want to write the code too restrictively. They want to be able to bring context into it to recognize that words like that are not always used as hate speech. At the same time, of course, so then that means we have to take into consideration the intentions and the response, as well as the actual linguistic meaning and the association of a word with racial slurring. So that's where I'm going to end it, is that the problem with these codes is they had to be too broad. They had to be too nuanced, but courts don't like nuance like that. The courts said, no, this is too vague. But it had to be vague. And so even though the Supreme Court said that hate speech is not protected, fighting words are not protected, they also declared that the laws that were written were too vague to actually be enacted and prosecuted. So basically, the speech codes were found to be unconstitutional, and that's why 20 years later, we don't have speech codes of this nature that try to identify what counts as hate speech and what doesn't, because it's just not prosecutable.